Hey everyone. Tonight, I want to share a story with you that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. This isn't just another spooky tale, it's something I lived through, something I barely made it out of. It was sent to me by a viewer who claimed they experienced something similar, but as I read their email, it dredged up memories I've tried to bury for years. It started when I was invited on a camping trip by my old college friend Mark. We hadn't seen each other in years, and he thought a weekend in the wilderness would be the perfect way to reconnect. He was always the adventurous type, the one who dragged us out of our dorms for late-night hikes or impromptu road trips. But this trip wasn't just the two of us. Mark had recently gotten into a group of amateur paranormal investigators, people who sought out haunted locations and unexplained phenomena for fun. He brought along two of his friends, Sarah and Dean, who were just as enthusiastic about the supernatural as he was. I wasn't as sold on the idea, but Mark's excitement was contagious, and I figured, why not? We headed out to a place called Black Hollow Woods. The forest was massive, sprawling over miles of remote wilderness, with no cell service and barely any signs of civilization. According to Mark, it was infamous for strange occurrences, disappearances, eerie sounds, sightings of shadowy figures. It was the perfect place for their investigation, he said. The first night started off normal enough. We set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches interlocking above us like a natural cathedral. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that carried the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed over old memories while Sarah and Dean set up their equipment: cameras, EMF meters, voice recorders. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to close in around us. The once cheerful flicker of the fire cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence as we all became hyper-aware of how isolated we were. Then the noises started. At first, it was subtle rustling in the underbrush, the kind of sound you'd expect from small animals. But soon, it grew louder, more deliberate, like something larger was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. Dean joked about Bigfoot, but no one laughed. We all stared into the darkness, trying to make out shapes in the shifting shadows. Probably just deer, Mark said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Sarah suggested we do an EVP session, an attempt to capture electronic voice phenomena. She handed me a voice recorder, insisting I ask questions to the darkness. It felt silly, but I went along with it. Is there anyone out there? Do you want to communicate with us? My voice sounded shaky, even to me. We sat in silence, waiting for a response. The forest was eerily quiet now, the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves absent. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, as if something or someone was watching us. Dean rewound the recording, playing it back through a small speaker. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a whisper. It was too quiet to make out words, but it was unmistakably there. We all froze, our eyes wide as we stared at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Mark nodded, his face pale. "Play it again." Dean rewound the tape, turning up the volume. The whisper came through louder this time, and though it was still garbled, I could swear it sounded like my name. My chest tightened, and I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Probably just interference. These things pick up all sorts of noise, right? But Sarah didn't look convinced. "It wasn't interference," she said softly. "It was too clear." The whisper wasn't the only thing we caught that night. As Sarah and Dean reviewed the footage from their cameras, they noticed something strange. In one of the shots, a tall, shadowy figure appeared in the background, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, it was just there. "It's probably just a tree," I said, my voice betraying my own doubt. But Dean shook his head. "It's not there in the next frame. Whatever it was, it moved." That was just the beginning. The real horror started the next night, when the forest stopped pretending to be ordinary. The next day, the group tried to shake off the unease from the previous night. Mark was adamant it was just overactive imaginations and coincidental shadows. though even he didn't sound entirely convinced. Sarah and Dean were thrilled, talking about the shadowy figure, as if it were the breakthrough they'd been searching for. I tried to go along with their enthusiasm, but a knot of dread had lodged itself in my stomach. By late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the trees felt warmer, the forest less foreboding. We decided to venture further into Black Hollow Woods to explore and set up for that night's investigation. Mark led the way with a map, his usual confidence returning. Dean carried his camera, constantly filming, while Sarah kept the EMF meter in hand, scanning for spikes. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves faded until all that remained was the crunch of our boots on the undergrowth. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step. We came across an old, overgrown trail that led us to a peculiar clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, maybe the remnants of a cabin or an old hunting lodge. Vines snaked up its walls, and the wooden beams had long since rotted away, leaving only the skeletal remains of a foundation. "This is perfect," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "A spot like this, it's bound to have some activity." "Or snakes," I muttered, scanning the area nervously. Dean chuckled but didn't stop filming. "Come on, this place has haunted written all over it. You don't find stuff like this every day." As we set up camp nearby, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker here, deeper, as if they could swallow you whole if you strayed too far from the group. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. We huddled around a new fire, its light casting flickering shadows on the stone ruins. Sarah and Dean began their EVP session again, this time within the ruins themselves, while Mark and I stayed by the fire. "Do you really believe in all this?" I asked him, keeping my voice low. He hesitated, poking at the fire with a stick. "I don't know. I mean, I've heard stories, seen videos, but being here, it feels different." Before I could respond, Sarah's shout cut through the night. "Mark, come here!" We scrambled to our feet and ran to where Sarah and Dean were standing in the ruins. Sarah was holding the EMF meter, its lights flashing wildly, the needle spiking into the red. "It's off the charts," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. Dean pointed his camera at the ruins, the lens trained on a dark corner where the stone had crumbled away. "I saw something move over there, something big." Mark grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the corner. The beam illuminated nothing but broken stones and tangled vines. "There's nothing there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dean replayed the footage on his camera. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of movement, something tall and dark slipping out of frame. It was fast, too fast to be an animal. The air around us grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The fire crackled and hissed in the distance, but its warmth felt a world away, and then we heard it. A sound like whispering, faint and indecipherable, carried on the breeze. It came from all directions, surrounding us, growing louder with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, clutching my jacket tighter. "It's them," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "Whatever's out here with us." Mark gestured for everyone to back toward the fire. "Stay close, let's not split up." The whispering grew louder, the words still unintelligible but carrying an undeniable malice. The shadows beneath the trees began to shift, moving unnaturally like liquid spilling across the ground. And then, from the darkness, came the footsteps. The footsteps were deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth with an eerie rhythm. They started far off but quickly grew louder, closing the distance between us and whatever was out there. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound authoritative. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then they started again, this time circling us, their pace unnervingly steady. The firelight cast wild, flickering shadows around the ruins, but we couldn't see anything beyond its reach. Dean raised his camera, trying to capture whatever was stalking us. "I don't see anything," he muttered, his voice low, "but it's out there. I can feel it." Sarah clung to the EMF meter, its lights flashing erratically. "It's right here," she said, her voice a shaky whisper. "It's all around us." And then, as suddenly as they began, the footsteps stopped, the whispering faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out the crackling of the fire. "Maybe it's gone," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Mark shook his head, scanning the tree line with his flashlight. "Stay close. Don't." Before he could finish, there was a deafening crash behind us. We spun around to see one of the stone walls of the ruins collapse, dust and debris billowing into the air. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from the settling dust, something stepped forward. It wasn't human. The figure was impossibly tall, its elongated limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, what looked like skin, was pale and mottled, stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly, as if observing us. Then it took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, each footfall echoing in the oppressive silence. "Run!" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run!" We bolted, our panic overriding any sense of direction. The flashlight beams bounced wildly as we tore through the woods, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind us. It didn't run, it didn't need to. Its strides were unnaturally long, and no matter how fast we moved, it stayed just behind us, its presence a looming shadow. I could hear Sarah screaming, Dean shouting something I couldn't make out. My legs burned, branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I ran blindly through the forest. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides, the air thick and suffocating. We burst into another clearing, our breaths ragged and desperate. The creature was gone at least, it wasn't visible, but the forest wasn't quiet. The whispering had returned, louder and more distinct, like dozens of voices overlapping, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "We can't stay here," Dean panted, clutching his camera tightly. Mark scanned the area with his flashlight, his face pale. "Which way? The campsite?" Sarah shook her head violently. "No, it knows where we are. We have to keep moving." And so we did. But no matter how far we ran, the forest didn't change. The trees looked the same, the path winding endlessly in circles. It was as if the woods themselves had trapped us, twisting and shifting to keep us lost. Then we saw it again. The creature was standing in the middle of the path ahead, its head tilted at the same unnatural angle. It raised one of its bony arms and pointed at us, though there were no eyes to direct its gaze. "That's it," Dean shouted, fumbling with his camera. "We're documenting this." "Dean, no!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The creature moved faster than I thought possible, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. Dean barely had time to react before it was on him, its elongated fingers wrapping around his neck. His scream was cut off as he was lifted off the ground, his camera falling to the dirt with a sickening crack. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing my arm. Mark and I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the sound of Dean's body hitting the ground spurred us into action. We ran, Sarah's sobs echoing in the darkness, the whispering growing louder with each step. We didn't stop running until our legs gave out, the burning in our muscles unbearable. The whispering still surrounded us, but it felt more distant now, as if the forest was giving us a moment's reprieve. Mark leaned against a tree, gasping for air, while Sarah sank to the ground, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Dean," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I looked back, expecting to see the creature in pursuit, but the path was empty. The only sign of Dean was the faint echo of his scream still ringing in my ears. "We couldn't do anything," Mark said, his voice shaking. "There was nothing we could do." Sarah glared at him, her anger cutting through her terror. "You brought us here. You wanted this." "Enough," I snapped, surprising even myself. "We need to get out of here. Blaming each other isn't going to help." Mark nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the ground. "We're close to the main trail. If we can find it, we can get back to the car." But the forest seemed to have other plans. As we stumbled through the undergrowth, the landscape became increasingly alien. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The air grew colder, carrying a damp, earthy smell that made it hard to breathe. Worse, the ground beneath our feet was no longer solid. The dirt turned to soft, spongy moss that squelched with every step. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, pulling us deeper into its clutches. "It's like a maze," Sarah muttered, clutching the EMF meter like a talisman. The device was still going wild, its lights flickering erratically. Mark stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" We froze, straining to listen. At first, there was only the oppressive silence. Then, faintly, came the sound of laughter. It was soft and childlike, yet it carried an unnatural echo, as if it were coming from every direction at once. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, my stomach twisting into knots. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice cracking. The laughter stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the trees. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." We turned and ran, but the forest wouldn't let us leave. The trees seemed to shift and close in, the paths twisting and looping back on themselves. No matter which direction we took, we always ended up back in the same gnarled tree with claw-like branches that seemed to reach for us. "This isn't real," Mark said, his voice trembling. "It can't be real." But it was real, too real. The laughter returned, louder and closer this time. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, darting between the trees. The growling grew more intense, accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. "It's coming," Sarah whispered, her grip tightening on my arm. Mark shone his flashlight into the darkness, the beam trembling as it caught movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, not the tall, skeletal creature from before, but something smaller, hunched over and unnervingly fast. It scuttled toward us on all fours, its limbs too long, its joints bending the wrong way. Its face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mask of flesh, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. "Run!" I screamed, yanking Sarah to her feet. We sprinted blindly through the forest, the creature's guttural growls growing louder as it pursued us. The mossy ground gave way to jagged rocks and uneven terrain, but we didn't dare slow down. Just when I thought my lungs would give out, we burst into another clearing. This one was different, a circle of dead trees surrounding a stagnant black pool of water. The air here was colder than anywhere else, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. "It stopped," Mark said, looking back. The creature was gone, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I turned to the pool, its surface unnaturally still, as if it were made of glass. A faint ripple disturbed the water, and then another. "Something's in there," Sarah said, backing away. Before we could react, a pale hand shot out of the water, its fingers impossibly long and thin. Another followed, and then a head emerged, a head without a face. The whispering returned, louder than ever, as more hands reached out of the pool, clawing at the edges as if trying to pull themselves free. For a moment, none of us could move. We were frozen, staring in disbelief as the faceless figures clawed their way out of the black pool. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from both within and around us. "Run!" I managed to choke out, though my legs felt like lead. "We have to run!" Sarah bolted first, her scream cutting through the whispers as she disappeared into the tree line. Mark and I followed, our movements frantic and uncoordinated, desperation propelling us forward. The sound of splashing water behind us told me the creatures were in pursuit. The forest closed in tighter, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of darkness. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely piercing the shadows. I could hear Mark panting behind me, his footsteps erratic. "This way," he shouted, veering left. I followed, the branches clawing at my face and arms as we plunged deeper into the woods. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, and panic gripped my chest like a vice. "Sarah!" I called out, my voice hoarse. There was no response, only the sound of the creatures crashing through the undergrowth behind us. Suddenly, Mark tripped, his flashlight flying from his hand as he hit the ground with a heavy thud. I skidded to a halt, turning back to help him. "Get up!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. But before we could move, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. "They're gone," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head. "No, they're still here." And then I saw it. One of the faceless figures stood just a few feet away, its head tilted in that unnerving, inquisitive way. Its body seemed to shimmer, blending with the darkness, as if it were part of the forest itself. Mark grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "We can't outrun them," he said, his voice barely audible. The figure took a step closer, its elongated fingers reaching out. The air around us grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that frost began to form on the leaves. My breath came out in visible puffs, each one quicker than the last. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a sound I didn't expect, a voice. It was faint but unmistakable. "Over here!" Sarah. She was alive. I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him with me, running toward the sound of her voice. The trees thinned out, the oppressive darkness giving way to the faint glow of moonlight. We stumbled into another clearing, and there she was. Sarah stood in the center, clutching the EMF meter like it was a lifeline. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." Mark didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the flashlight from his pocket and shone it around the clearing, searching for a way out. But before we could move, the creatures appeared again. They emerged from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. They formed a circle around us, their faceless heads tilting in unison. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispering returned, louder than ever, filling my head with a dizzying rush of voices. My vision blurred, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to let go, to give in. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "We're not giving up." I grabbed a branch from the ground, its end jagged and sharp. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The first creature stepped forward, its elongated arm reaching for me. I swung the branch with all my strength, the wood splintering against its body. The creature didn't flinch, didn't react. Mark pulled me back, his flashlight beam flickering wildly. "We can't fight them," he shouted. "We have to find a way out." But there was no way out. The creatures closed in, their movements slow but relentless. The whispering grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. And then, just as I thought it was over, the ground beneath us gave way. We fell into darkness, the air rushing past us as we plummeted into what felt like an endless void. My stomach lurched, my screams lost in the deafening roar of the wind. When I hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from my lungs. Everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It seeped into my bones, a biting chill that made every breath ache. The second thing was the darkness, absolute and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't tell where I was, but the faint, metallic tang in the air told me it wasn't the forest anymore. "Mark? Sarah?" I croaked, my voice echoing unnaturally in the void. A weak groan came from somewhere to my left. "I'm here," Mark said, his voice strained. I crawled toward the sound, my hands brushing against uneven, damp ground. It felt like stone, slick with moisture. My fingers found Mark's arm, and I shook him gently. "Are you okay?" "I think so," he muttered. "Where are we?" "I don't know." "Sarah?" I called out again, louder this time. A faint cough answered from somewhere above us. "I'm stuck." Sarah's voice came, shaky and weak. "I can't move." Mark and I scrambled to our feet, the darkness disorienting. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart sinking when I realized it was gone, probably lost during the fall. "Hold on," Mark said, pulling his own flashlight from his jacket pocket. The beam flickered to life, casting a dim light around us. We were in a cavern, the walls jagged and glistening with some kind of slimy residue. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, their patterns erratic and unsettling. Sarah was above us, tangled in a mess of roots and debris, lodged in a crack in the wall. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark and I worked quickly, climbing the uneven wall to reach her. The roots were surprisingly tough, like they didn't want to let her go. With a final pull, we freed her, and the three of us tumbled to the cavern floor in a heap. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, clutching the EMF meter. It was still flickering wildly, its lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mark pointed the flashlight down one of the tunnels that stretched out from the cavern. "That way," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We moved cautiously, the tunnel narrowing as we went. The air grew colder, the walls closing in until we had to duck to avoid scraping our heads. The symbols continued, glowing faintly now, as if they were alive. "What do you think these mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to know," I replied, my unease growing with each step. The whispering returned, faint at first but growing louder the deeper we went. It felt like the walls themselves were speaking, the voices echoing all around us. Then the tunnel opened up into another chamber. This one was larger, the ceiling disappearing into the shadows above. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface covered in what looked like fresh blood. Mark stopped short, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What is this place?" Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "They're here," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. From the shadows, the creatures emerged. There were more of them now, their faceless heads tilting in unison as they moved closer. They surrounded us, cutting off any chance of escape. Mark swung his flashlight wildly, the beam catching their pale, skeletal forms. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice was thick with fear. One of the creatures stepped forward, its elongated fingers reaching for the altar. It placed a hand on the blood-stained stone, and the symbols on the walls flared to life, casting the room in an eerie red glow. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the creatures were chanting in some ancient, forgotten language. "What do they want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. I didn't have an answer. The creature by the altar turned toward us, its faceless head somehow exuding malice. It raised its arm, pointing at the three of us, and I felt a sudden crushing pressure in my chest. Mark dropped to his knees, gasping for air. Sarah screamed, the sound cutting off abruptly as she collapsed beside him. The pressure intensified, and I felt myself being pulled forward, toward the altar. I clawed at the ground, trying to resist, but it was no use. As I was dragged closer, the symbols on the altar began to pulse, their glow matching the rhythm of my pounding heart. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on cold stone. My body felt heavy, every muscle aching, as if I had been crushed under an enormous weight. The first thing I saw was the altar, now dormant, its symbols dim and lifeless. The creatures were gone, and the oppressive whispering had ceased. "Mark? Sarah?" I croaked, my throat raw. A groan came from nearby, and I turned my head to see Sarah stirring, her face pale but alive. Mark was a few feet away, slumped against the cavern wall, his flashlight still clutched in his trembling hand. "We're still here," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Mark forced himself to sit up, his face drawn and haunted. "What happened? I thought we were," he trailed off, his eyes darting to the altar. I didn't have an answer. My mind was a blur of terror and confusion, fragments of the event swirling like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. "We need to leave," I said, struggling to my feet. "Now." Mark nodded, his movements sluggish as he pushed himself up. Sarah leaned on me for support, her legs unsteady as we began to move. The cavern was eerily silent, the oppressive air lifting slightly as we retraced our steps through the narrow tunnels. The glowing symbols no longer pulsed, their faint light barely illuminating the path. As we stumbled through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "We're almost out," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tunnel began to widen, the air growing fresher with each step. I dared to hope that we were nearing the surface when the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" Mark turned, his flashlight beam sweeping the tunnel. It was empty, but the sound persisted, growing louder. "Run," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, the tunnel seeming to stretch endlessly before us. The footsteps grew closer, joined by the faint whispering we thought we had escaped. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't dare stop. A faint light appeared ahead, a sliver of moonlight breaking through the darkness. It was an exit. "We're almost there," Mark shouted, his voice filled with a desperate hope. But the creatures weren't far behind. Their guttural growls echoed through the tunnel, the sound of their scuttling movements sending a surge of adrenaline through me. As we reached the opening, Mark stopped abruptly, his flashlight revealing a sheer drop. The exit led to the side of a cliff, the forest far below shrouded in mist. "There's no way down," Sarah cried, panic overtaking her. The whispering grew louder, the creatures closing in. Mark glanced at me, his face set with determination. "We have to jump." "What? Are you insane?" I shouted, the fear in my voice betraying my resolve. "There's no other way," he insisted. The creatures emerged from the darkness, their faceless forms silhouetted against the faint light. Without another word, Mark leapt, his body vanishing into the mist below. "Come on!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my hand. Together, we jumped. The fall was disorienting, the wind rushing past us as the ground hurtled closer. I braced for impact, expecting the worst, but instead, we landed in a freezing river that broke our fall and carried us downstream. The current was strong, dragging us along as we struggled to stay afloat. My limbs felt numb, but the cold was a welcome shock, a reminder that we were alive. Eventually, the river deposited us on a rocky shore. I crawled onto the bank, coughing and gasping for air. Sarah was beside me, shivering uncontrollably but unharmed. Mark was further downstream, clinging to a fallen log. He made his way to us, collapsing onto the rocks with a relieved groan. "We made it," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. I looked around, the forest now eerily quiet. The creatures were gone, the oppressive presence lifted. But something told me we hadn't truly escaped. As we stumbled back to the car, the events of the night played over and over in my mind. The faceless creatures, the altar, the whispering voices, they had left a mark on us that couldn't be erased. When we finally reached the parking lot, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. We didn't speak as we climbed into the car, our silence heavy with unspoken fears. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest watching us. But when I looked again, it was gone. That was the last camping trip we ever took. None of us speak about what happened that night, but the memories linger, haunting the edges of our dreams. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear the whispering. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before I start, I want to share something a little different, something that's been haunting me ever since it happened. This one comes from an email I received a while ago. A listener sent me a chilling account of their camping experience, one that feels like it's straight out of a horror movie. But trust me, this isn't fiction. It's all too real, and I had the unfortunate privilege of being there. So, let me take you back to that night. It was supposed to be just a regular camping trip, nothing too special. A couple of friends, a few beers, and the kind of campfire stories that make you laugh, not shiver. We made our way to a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. Honestly, looking back, I think that's what made it worse, the isolation. No cell service, no one else around. It was just us and the dense trees that seemed to swallow up any sound. We set up camp quickly, eager to get the fire going before nightfall. The sky was still light, but the forest felt like it was holding its breath. Something about it felt wrong. But I pushed that feeling away, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, as it usually does. But as the sun dipped lower, that eerie feeling I'd dismissed started to creep back. We were laughing, joking around the campfire, when the temperature suddenly dropped. Not gradually, like you'd expect in the evening, but abruptly, like someone had just turned the dial on the world and everything went cold. The fire crackled and popped, its warm glow fighting back against the chilling air, but it couldn't reach us fully. I glanced at my friends. They were already bundling up, pulling jackets tighter around themselves, but I could tell from the way they were looking around, even they could feel it now, the heaviness in the air. That's when we heard it. At first, it was faint, a rustling sound coming from the trees behind our campsite. I'm not talking about the typical sounds of Forest Lefino. This was different. It was as if something big was moving, snapping branches underfoot. Too slow, too deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I remember thinking, it's probably just a deer or some other large animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My friends were nervous too. We all stared into the woods, trying to make out any shapes in the thickening darkness. But all we saw were shadows that seemed to shift and sway unnaturally. Then, just as we were about to laugh it off, dismissing it as a trick of the wind, the sound came again. This time, it was closer. And this time, it wasn't the branches snapping. It was the unmistakable sound of something breathing deep, labored breaths that didn't match any creature I'd ever heard. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sense that we were being watched. I turned to my friend Steve, who was sitting across the fire from me. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I nodded, my throat tight. The sound had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. We tried to laugh it off. I mean, it was just some weird animal, right? Maybe a bear or something. But then the air got even colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The campfire flickered violently, casting strange shadows on the ground. And that's when we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light. It was tall, and naturally tall, and it stood completely still, as though it was waiting for something. Or someone. I couldn't make out any details at first. It was like my mind was refusing to process what I was seeing. But as the firelight flickered, I saw something else, a movement. It wasn't the figure that was moving, but rather something hanging from its body. I couldn't tell if it was a cloak or something else, but it was swaying, like it was alive. That's when panic set in. "Steve," I started, my voice breaking. "Do you see that?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the figure, just as mine were. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching us. Watching me. I don't know how long we stood there staring at it. It felt like an eternity. But then, in an instant, it was gone, vanished back into the shadows of the forest. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. The fear was thick in the air, and all we could do was sit there, our backs to the fire, hearts pounding. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a prank from someone else in the woods. But deep down, we all knew. Something was out there. Something was watching us. And it wasn't done with us yet. It's hard to describe what happened next. The air was still thick with tension, but none of us had the courage to say anything. The shadows around the campfire seemed to stretch and contort, like they were alive, responding to the presence that had been watching us. We sat in a haunted silence, trying to convince ourselves that we were just overreacting. Maybe it was just a tree, a trick of the light, anything to explain what we saw. But deep down, we all knew the truth. There was something out there. As the night wore on, the fear didn't subside. In fact, it only deepened. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that felt deliberate, like someone was moving through the forest, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We kept looking around, half expecting the tall figure to appear again, but it never did. Instead, the sounds grew louder, branches snapping, leaves crunching beneath heavy feet. But whenever we looked into the trees, there was nothing. Maybe we should pack up, Steve said, his voice cracking. His hand was shaking as he reached for his flashlight, casting frantic beams of light into the darkness. No way, I replied quickly. I wasn't sure if I said it to calm myself or to reassure him, but I didn't want to move. I couldn't shake the thought that if we left now, we'd be giving whatever it was out there the chance to follow us. I don't know what I thought would happen if we stayed, but it seems safer than the alternative. We tried to continue our evening as normal. We talked, but it was forced, strained. No one really wanted to admit the truth that something was wrong, but we couldn't deny the feeling anymore. It was as if the forest itself had become a living thing, shifting, whispering. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind made us jump. Then, just when I thought I might go crazy from the tension, something did happen. A scream, a sharp, jagged cry that cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't human. We all froze, the sound reverberating through our bones. It was a scream of terror, raw and desperate. Without thinking, I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The firelight flickered wildly, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the woods, something large, just out of sight. The scream echoed again, closer this time, and I realized it was coming from deeper in the forest. Something was in trouble. Did you hear that? I said, turning to my friends. My voice felt distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. We need to check that out. What? Are you crazy? Steve's eyes were wide, his face pale. It could be a trap. I didn't care. That scream, it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It was primal, animalistic, like something was in agony. We have to go, I said, barely recognizing the words coming out of my mouth. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way toward the source of the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. The woods seemed to close in on us, the trees growing denser as we walked, until the light from our torches barely made a dent in the darkness. The path was barely visible, the underbrush thick and tangled, but we pushed forward. The further we went, the worse it got. The air was heavier now, suffocating, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. I felt a cold sweat trickling down my back, and my breath came out in shallow gasps. And then we heard it again, that scream. But this time, it was different. It was closer, but also wrong. It was distorted, like something was trying to imitate a human voice, but failing terribly. The sound was so horrifying that it made my stomach churn, and I nearly gagged. We stopped in our tracks, and that's when I saw it. A figure, crouched low in the shadows. I couldn't make out much detail, but it was tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It had its back to us, but I could see its shoulders twitching, as if it were shaking. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. "Get back," Steve whispered, his voice trembling, but it was too late. The creature turned. Its face was a nightmare, distorted, with eyes that were too wide, too dark like holes in its skull. Its mouth hung open, stretching far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. I couldn't breathe. My legs were frozen in place, as if my body refused to move, and all I could do was stare at it. The thing let out a gurgling growl, and I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. It was as if the sound was in my head, not just in the air. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move. Then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath us shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something else, something unnatural. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the trees, shaking the very earth beneath us. The creature, it knew we were there. It was like it was testing us, sensing our fear. "Run!" Steve shouted, breaking me from my stupor. But it was too late. The creature lunged. I won't lie, what happened after that night is a blur. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up by the campfire, disoriented, with my friends around me, all of us huddled together like we were waiting for something. Waiting for it. I'll never forget the look in their eyes. We didn't have to speak. We all knew that whatever we'd seen, whatever we had barely escaped, it was still out there, waiting for us. And it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. We didn't speak much in the hours that followed. The fire had died down to embers, the crackling sound replaced by the unsettling silence of the woods around us. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what could we say? What could we even do? The night felt suffocating, the shadows stretching longer and deeper with each passing minute. I still couldn't shake the image of that thing's face, the way its eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger, the way it moved with unnatural speed, as if it was no longer bound by the laws of nature. We sat in a tense silence, our breaths shallow, as if speaking would draw its attention back to us. It was Steve who finally broke the quiet. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaky. "We need to pack up and get the hell out of here." I nodded, unable to form words. I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen, what had chased us. But even more, I was scared of what would happen if we didn't leave. Would it come for us again? What did it want? And how could we escape something that seemed to know exactly where we were at all times? "Let's go," I whispered. We quickly gathered our things, our movements frantic but careful, as if the slightest sound might alert whatever was lurking in the dark. The pack we'd left behind near the fire now felt like an anchor, a reminder that we were still trapped here. But as we started to make our way back, the forest felt even more alive, the shadows pressing in closer with each step we took. And then, just when we thought we might make it back to the safety of the clearing, we heard it again. A whisper. Not a human voice, not a bird or animal, but a low, rasping sound like wind passing through dry leaves, but with an edge to it, a sound that shouldn't have been there. We froze. The whisper came again, closer this time. It was soft, almost like it was speaking directly into our ears, but from all around us. My flashlight flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees, a figure, pale and thin, shifting between the trunks like it was gliding through the forest. It was following us. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, the trees behind us snapped. There was a loud, bone-shaking crack of branches, and something large slammed into the ground. It was too fast, too close. I didn't need to look back to know it was the thing from earlier, the creature that had haunted us. I glanced around wildly, trying to find some way out, but the forest was closing in around us. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, the dirt soft and shifting like it was pulling us down. We ran, and in the chaos of flight, I heard the worst thing possible, that horrible, guttural laughter. It was mocking us. Steve was the first to trip, his foot catching on a root as he stumbled forward. I reached out to grab him, but the moment my hand touched his shoulder, I felt it. Something cold, something wet and unnatural, wrapped around my wrist. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. Nothing but the darkness. I yanked my arm free, my heart thundering in my chest, and pulled Steve up. He was shaking, too frightened to say anything. But we didn't need words. We knew what was happening. It was hunting us. The creature was playing with us, toying with our fear, and we were running out of time. We didn't stop to think, didn't stop to make sense of what was happening. All we could do was run as fast as we could, hoping that somehow we could escape. But the forest was no longer a place of refuge. It felt like the trees themselves were alive, closing in around us with each step. The air was thick, stifling, and every breath I took burned my lungs. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, until I could hear the scraping of claws against bark. It was right on our heels. Then, in the distance, I saw it. The clearing, the edge of the woods. If we could just make it there, we might have a chance. But just as I thought we were close, the ground beneath me buckled. My foot caught on something, and I fell to the ground, my hands slamming into the earth. The force of the fall knocked the breath out of me. I scrambled to get up, but before I could, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the trees, heading straight for me. I looked up just in time to see it. The creature stood over me, its towering form blocking out the dim moonlight, its eyes glistening with malice. The air around it felt wrong, distorted, like reality itself was warping. Its mouth opened wide, a low growl vibrating through the air. Time slowed. Everything around me seemed to disappear, and I was locked in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then a flash of light. A sharp, blinding beam cut through the darkness, and the creature let out a piercing screech, its body recoiling. It wasn't a flashlight, not like the ones we'd been carrying. This light was different, pure, intense, almost otherworldly. "Run!" someone shouted. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and bolted toward the clearing. Behind me, I heard the creature's roar, but it sounded distant now, fading into the night. I didn't look back. We made it to the edge of the forest, breathless, covered in dirt and trembling, but we were alive. For now. We didn't talk about what happened immediately. We couldn't. All we could do was sit there, in the clearing, the once comforting sounds of the forest now drowned out by the pounding of our hearts. The creature, the thing that had been hunting us, had disappeared, or so we thought. I looked at my friends, their faces pale, wide-eyed, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. What the hell was that thing? But no one dared to ask. Instead, we just stared into the forest, expecting it to swallow us whole at any moment. The light from our flashlights felt weak and small in the overwhelming darkness. The forest seemed alive, too alive, as if the trees themselves were watching us, waiting for the next move. But we were too scared to make a move. It was Steve who finally broke the silence. We need to leave," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." I nodded, too exhausted and terrified to argue. I didn't care where we went at this point. I just needed to get away from that place, from whatever had been following us. I could still hear its laugh echoing in my ears, the hollow, mocking sound that sent a chill down my spine. We gathered our things quickly as we could without making any noise. But just as I was about to grab my backpack, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing just inside the tree line. I froze. It wasn't the creature, it was a person. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I squinted into the darkness, the figure didn't move. They were tall, wearing something that looked like a dark jacket, and their face was obscured by shadows. My breath caught in my throat. "Who is that?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. Steve followed my gaze and his eyes widened. I don't know." The figure stood motionless for a long moment. Then, without a sound, it stepped back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "Was that a person?" Steve asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I answered. But deep down, I felt something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of dread that weighed down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever that was had been waiting for us to see it. That wasn't just a random person in the woods. It was something else. But there was no time to dwell on that. We needed to leave, and fast. We made our way through the woods, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. But the sense of something watching us never went away. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature stalking us again. But it wasn't just the creature. There was something else in the woods with us, something unnatural. And that's when we heard it. A voice, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was almost a whisper, like a breath against my ear. "You can't escape." I froze, my blood running cold. I felt it again, the presence, that same feeling of being watched, of being hunted. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but I saw nothing. "You hear that?" I whispered to Steve, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I hear it too." Then it came again, louder this time, almost like a low growl. "You can't escape." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and started running. My legs moved before my brain could even process it. Steve was right behind me, but we weren't alone anymore. The forest around us seemed to come alive, the trees groaning and creaking as though they were alive, shifting, closing in on us. And then it happened. The ground beneath me gave way. 1 second, I was running full speed, and the next, I was falling. I didn't have time to scream. The world spun and I landed hardened dirt, on rockspane exploding through my body as I crashed to the ground. For a moment, I couldn't move. My head was spinning, my vision blurry, but I could hear Steve yelling my name, his voice panicked. I forced myself to my hands and knees, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when I looked up, the darkness seemed thicker, darker. I couldn't see anything but black. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it closer now, so much closer than before. The voice, "You're not leaving." I looked around frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight was useless now, the beam flickering and weak. But that voice, that horrible voice, wasn't coming from any direction I could see. It was everywhere. "We need to move," I said, forcing myself to stand. Now, we scrambled to get up, but before we could go anywhere, the ground shook again. The trees groaned, and the air grew thick, suffocating, like we were being smothered by the forest itself. Then I saw something, a figure, a person standing just ahead of us. This one wasn't hiding. This one wanted us to see it. It was the same figure we had seen earlier, the one from the trees. But this time, there was something different. It was no longer just a shadow in the darkness. This time, the figure was fully illuminated by the moonlight, and I could see it clearly. Its face wasn't human. Its eyes were wide, almost too wide, and its skin was ashen. Its mouth was wide open, filled with jagged teeth, and from its throat came a low, gravelly whisper, "You will never leave." I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was run. Run like my life depended on it. And in the distance, just behind the creature, I saw something else light. A bright, shining light, cutting through the darkness. "Go to the light!" Steve screamed. We didn't hesitate. We ran toward it, the voice of the creature chasing us, echoing in the night. But the light wasn't just a light, it was a gateway. The moment we reached it, the world around us shifted. The trees, the air, the ground, it all seemed to blur together, warping in a way I can't explain. And then we were out. We were back at the campsite. The fire was still burning. The night was calm, but the air still felt heavy. The presence lingered. We stood there, on the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath. My heart was still racing, my mind reeling. But one thing was clear, something had changed. The air around us felt off. The night, though still, was no longer just quiet, it felt charged, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We had escaped the creature, but it didn't feel like we were free. Steve collapsed by the campfire, his face pale and drawn. "That thing, it was real," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't sound like the same person who had been so eager to hike through these woods just hours before. "We should never have come here," I nodded, unable to form words. We were lucky to be alive, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. The feeling of being watched, the voices, the creature, it had all been far too real. But that wasn't the worst part. As we sat in silence, staring into the fire, the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees suddenly grew louder, almost like it was rushing toward us. It sounded deliberate. But this wasn't just wind. This was something else. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that something was coming, something worse than the creature we'd barely escaped. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me or if it was real, but the sight of it made my blood run cold. It stood still, its head slightly tilted, as if it was studying us. And just like before, it didn't move. It didn't say a word, it simply watched. "We're not alone," I whispered, barely able to form the words. Steve's eyes darted to where I was staring. The blood drained from his face. No, that's not possible," he said, his voice shaking. "It can't be. It's not real." But it was real. We both knew it. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling as I turned it toward the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light hit the spot where the figure had been standing, it was gone. There was no one there. My heart raced. I blinked several times, thinking maybe I was seeing things. But when I looked again, I saw the faintest movement, something dark, slipping behind the trees, almost too fast for me to track. "What the hell is going on?" Steve's voice cracked as he stood up, his body rigid with fear. I didn't know. I couldn't answer that. We started to pack up, all of us too afraid to stay there any longer. But as we moved around the campsite, something caught my eye, a small folded piece of paper lying under the edge of the tent. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was there, almost as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. There was no name on it, just a message written in ink words that seemed to jump off the page with unnatural weight. "You shouldn't have come. This place is ours, and you are now a part of it." The words sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I handed the note to Steve, and we both stared at it in disbelief. "What does this mean?" Steve asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my heart hammering in my chest. "But I think we've just learned something we weren't supposed to know." And that's when I remembered the figure in the trees, the way it had watched us, the way it had seemed to be waiting. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't just some random hiker or camper. The creature, the figure, the voice said was all connected. It was as though we had wandered into a place where the rules of the world didn't apply, a place that belonged to something else, something ancient, something powerful. I turned to my friends, each of them looking just as confused and terrified as I was. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking with urgency. "Now." But before we could gather our things, a new sound filled the air louder than before, like a heavy, rhythmic pounding. At first, I thought it was just my heart, but then it grew stronger, more distinct, until I realized it was coming from the forest. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of something large, something heavy, moving through the woods toward us. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows on the ground. The noise grew louder. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, like something was walking toward us. "Get back," I hissed to my friends. "Get away from the trees." But it was too late. From the darkness emerged a new figure, larger than any of the others, towering over the trees. It was a silhouette at first, but as it moved closer, it became clear. The creature was no longer just a shadow. It had shape, form, and it was massive. I could see the outline of its body, twisted and grotesque, like a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth was open wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth dripping with saliva. It looked like it was smiling at us. The ground shook again, and the creature let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. "You can't leave," it hissed. I didn't wait to hear the rest. Without a second thought, I turned and ran. My friends followed, but the world around us seemed to be closing in. The trees seemed to move, the darkness thickening, as though the forest itself was alive, reaching out to drag us back. But we couldn't stop. We ran as fast as we could, but no matter how far we went, it felt like the creature was always behind us. The footsteps were heavy, relentless. And then, just as I thought we would be caught, we saw it. The clearing, the path out of the woods. We didn't stop to think. We ran straight for the exit, not daring to look back. And as we emerged from the forest, gasping for breath, we turned to look one last time. There was nothing. The forest was silent. The creature was gone, but I could still hear its voice, echoing in my mind, whispering the same words over and over. "You are ours now." That's the end of our story. I know what you're thinking. Could it all have been a nightmare? A hallucination from fear and exhaustion? Maybe. But part of me feels like that forest, that place, isn't done with us yet. Maybe one day we'll go back. Maybe we won't. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching. And I can't escape the voice in my head. You are ours now.